Hello, everybody. It's Carol and Ducey here for Quiltside Chats. I'm so pleased to have you here today. Um, it appears that we might be having a couple little glitches with our intros today, so we don't have our typical introduction. So just let me remind you that Quiltside Chats is a program that is sponsored both by the American Quilt Study Group and the International Quilt Museum here in Lincoln, Nebraska. My name is Carolyn Ducey. I'm in Lincoln in my office, and I'm really thrilled today to have a wonderful conversation with Terrell for us. Molly, can you bring up both of us on the screen? Molly is running things behind the facade here, so she's going to be the one that's kind of controlling some of the programming, and she's giving it a try. Terry, can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine, Carolyn.
Great.
Hopefully, at some point, we'll also be able to see the slides.
Well, I know Molly's working on that in the background. So while we're working on that, we have such a fun program today. Terry and I share a love of chintz quilts, and we have for, gosh, I don't know how many years we've worked together now, Terry. And you've been a lot more active in the research area than I have recently, and we're going to see some great evidence of that today. Before we get really into our discussion, though, let me introduce Terry more formally. So today, our speaker, our guest who has picked out a quilt that she would sneak out of the museum if it weren't a crime. And Terry has picked out one of our chintz, kind of a chintz wild goose chase variation from the collection. Terry is a member of the American Quilt Study Group and has published articles in both Uncoverings and Blanket Statements, and is webmaster and chief creator of content for the Floral Motifs on Early Chintz website, which you can find at flowersonchintz.com. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Terry has given presentations on textile history to a variety of groups, including the Daughters of the American Revolution, Colonial Williamsburg, the Denver Botanic Gardens School of Botanical Art and Illustration, and regional and local quilt study groups. Her interests include the sources and evolution of quilt textile designs, the close association between botanical illustrations and early English chintz, industrial production of chintz and indigo textiles, and center medallion and chintz applique quilts. Everything I love too, Terry. So we're so happy to have you here. Thank you for joining me today.
Well,
for those
I'm
of
happy.
You don't miss Terry's latest article that just came out in Uncoverings this year. So congratulations on that, Terry.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here today. It's been far too long since we've had a conversation, Carolyn.
It has been. It has been. And, you know, we have both just fallen in love with those beautiful chintz fabrics of the kind of, well, I'd say the pre-1850s period of chintz production. Is that kind of 1800 to 1850, or what are your kind of parameters?
Well, generally, yes, 1800 to 1850, but especially in preparing things for the website, I have been looking more from 1750 to 1900 for a variety of flowers. Part of the reason for that is that I have more than almost, I should say, 200 different flowers or floral motifs identified on the website, and it is getting a little harder to find new ones. But
Wow.
The paper that I just did for Uncoverings was actually on a copper plate print, a toile, what we call a toile today, and it was actually first printed in England in 1761. So very shortly after copper plate printing was applied to fabric production.
I see. Well, what do you think, or what were some of the origins where the influence or I can't think of the word I'm trying to use, the influence of of items that impacted chintz design. I know there were a lot of connections to gardening and gardening magazines. Where did we find all of these floral designs in addition to fabrics?
Well, that's a very good question. At the time that chintz was beginning to be printed in England, at least, or in Europe, I should say, they used a lot of designs from embroidery from historic periods in England. They also used illustrations in botanical botanical books like hortuses and floras. A hortus is the flowers that grow in a certain area in gardens or are domesticated, and a flora is flowers that basically grow wild in an area or are native to an area. And also realize that a lot of discovery was going on. People were sailing around the world. They were exploring new areas. Australia was discovered. And with all of those new places, people found a whole lot of new plants, and people were excited about them. And yes, then they ended up in a lot of English gardens. And if the English couldn't grow them in gardens, they put them in hothouses. Hothouses became or glass houses in general became really popular in England in that same period of time.
Well, and it's fascinating that I love doing research on that early period where we actually had people that were plant hunters that would go out and find these gorgeous plants that they could bring back from other cultures and bring them here, to English and American gardens. And that was something I had known nothing about before I did that research.
One of the earliest plant hunters was a pharaoh in Egypt, a female pharaoh by the name of Hatshepsut. She sent a group of plant hunters out to bring back various trees that were used for religious purposes. The sap of the trees were used for religious purposes. And I know that just a couple of years ago, the Denver Botanic Garden sent a plant hunting team to Mongolia because
Mongolia, wow.
Well, the environment in Mongolia is a lot like the environment in Denver. So they came back with a lot of really wonderful plants. Yeah.
That's so interesting. I never compared those, but I just assumed it was so much more frigid in Mongolia than anywhere near me. That's so interesting.
Well, it gets fairly cold in Denver in the wintertime, but Mongolia does have summer. And so, yeah, both are shrub, scrub, wetlands, shrubs, scrub areas. So, yeah, not wetlands.
Well, I'm flipping through a book that I had on my desk. How's it going, Molly, getting that PowerPoint up? I think Molly's still working on it. So I was trying to find a photo, and the only photo I can find of the quilt that we were going to talk about today is pretty tiny, unfortunately. I'm trying to think of how else I could get a better image to you all.
Well, the advertisement for the Quiltside chat has a picture of the quilt in it.
True. And hopefully everybody is seeing that front page where we've got that beautiful chintz quilt. So Molly, what do you think you can talk to us about without slides? I know without images it's going to be tough, but what I would encourage everyone to do, if you look at the slide that's on the screen, you'll see the number of this quilt, which is the object number that we use to track it, which is 1997.007.0486. Now on the screen they use dashes, but if you went to our website and went into search and put that number in with dots instead of dashes, you could pull that quilt up. If I could share screen, I don't know how to share my screen on this particular program. Otherwise I would. But in the meantime, if people wanted to go to our website and take a look, they could also pull up the image of the quilt and zoom in on it. So Terry, why don't you just, I'm going to start out by giving kind of what we call kind of the tombstone information on the quilt. And then why don't you just, let's do what we can without the images. So the quilt that we're looking at, we do call a wild goose chase quilt. It's almost more of a strippy. That's kind of a secondary name for it than a wild goose chase, but it's got both the strips of chintz, which are piece strips, and then the strips of wild goose chase that go between those strips. We don't have a maker on this quilt. We don't know who made it. We have a attribution of probably New England on it, which is still pretty loosey-goosey, and just a date of 1830 to 1850. The quilt is large. It's 105 by 111, which is not unusual for our early quilts. And of course, it's hand-pieced, hand-quilted, and has a tape binding on it. So that's the basics. So Terry, what else? What drew you to this? I kind of know these answers already, but what drew you to this quilt?
Well, I affectionately know the quilt as bars and flying geese. Strip quilts are also called strippy quilts or bar quilts. That's the name of bars. And obviously the flying geese are there too. Typically, strip quilts are made up of strips of whole cloth quilt, alternating, or strips of whole cloth quilt alternating with pieced blocks. And in the early part of in the early 1800s, the typical pieced blocks that you would find in this kind of quilt would be either flying geese or some sort of star block. So this is very typical of the period from 1825 to 1850, which was probably the first period of popularity for strip quilts. There was another period of popularity between 1880 and 1920. And today, strip quilts are also popular. So this quilt is typical of the time period of strip quilts when it was made. The picture that was used on the advertisement for this Quiltside chat actually shows the quilt upside down if you look at the quilt based on the floral motifs on the quilt. So instead of flying north, the geese actually are flying south. The geese are generally, their flying geese blocks are made out of what it's called dress prints. So they have sort of a dark brown to black background. The background has either tiny white dots on it or little floral white sprigs on it. The geese themselves are much lighter. They range from white with small figures on them to light tan to medium brown. There are light pink geese and dark and light blue, geese on the quilt. And the geese strips are about 4 inches wide. There are 282 geese on the strip quilt. Yes, I did count them. So, and interestingly enough, for every flying goose, there is a mate, so to speak. There is one that is made out of exactly the same fabric, and it's in the same spot on another bar. So,
in other words, there's a series of order in the triangles?
Yes, there is. If you start
all the way across the quilt?
Yes.
But, I mean, so each strip. I just never noticed that, Terry. I didn't realize there was that uniformity to it.
Well, if you look at the two flying geese strips in the center and start at the bottom and start looking up it, they match. If you look at the next two strips down, the flying geese match. If you look at the outside two flying geese strips, they match all the way from top to bottom.
Of course they do.
There is more organization in these flying geese strips than I ever imagined. I didn't realize this until I started looking at it. And as a quilter myself, I will tell you that whoever made this quilt is a heck of a lot more organized than I am. I would never keep strips.
No, it's interesting though, because when you first glance at it and you see it, you think it's kind of a scrappy kind of a pattern. And you just kind of get this idea, oh, people didn't think that much about it. They just picked things up off a pile. And I said that just a couple weeks ago in a program. She just maybe picked it up off the pile. But I think far more than we realize, people plan things out carefully. These were all really deliberate choices.
Oh, absolutely. And then if you look at the pieces of chintz, she has a similar pattern in the pieces of chintz. The pieces of chintz in the bars of chintz are kind of irregular sizes, but they are located, if you start at the two outside bars, each chintz is matched. There are 5 pieces of chintz going down the outside bars, and each one of them is matched with its counterpart on the other bar, parallel across. The sizes aren't exact, because yes, this must be a scrap quilt. The widths are uniform, but the lengths are different. And for the two out,
I'm sorry to interrupt. The fact that she's matching and you see that kind of symmetry in there, that means she's got a lot of fabric she's working with, doesn't it?
Well, not necessarily. She may have a pile of scraps, and okay, the chintz strips on this quilt are 11 to 14 inches wide. They aren't uniform across the quilt, but the outer 2 strips are the same width. The next 2 strips are the same width. The next 2 strips in are the same width, but the lengths are different. And since chintz fabric was printed between 23 and 27.5 inches wide at the time, and since these strips vary from 11 to 13 inches wide, you could actually take a piece of fabric and cut it vertically and make pieces that essentially the same size that match. So you could match it across.
So not so much fabric.
There are a couple of pieces of fabric that show up 3 times, and there are a few pieces of fabric that show up only once, based on exactly how you classify an exact same matching fabric. There are between 25 and 30 different chintzes on this particular quilt.
That's amazing. Well, hey Terry, let me stop you for a second. Molly put up a link here on the screen that is a link for the PowerPoint, and I can't seem to get that. I don't think I can do that, but I don't know, Terry, you wanted to try to go to that link, or Molly, can Terry go to that link? There it is. Can you go in the chat? Let's see if we can open that up. Yeah, there.
Got it.
Terry, can you link
coming up?
Great. So now we've got, thanks, Molly. That's perfect. All right. Well, so now we've got the PowerPoint, which I think is going to be really fascinating. So Terry, just take it from here and let's go on through all these beautiful images you have for us.
Okay.
We may have to see if you, I don't know if you can change the slides, or you might have to have Molly change the slides for you.
Okay, I can. starting at the beginning slide, that's the title slide, and that's the IQM accession number.
Right.
I talked about a typical strip quilt from the 1825 to 1850 period, and the next slide is of one from IQM's collection. Hang on, it's taking a moment to get.
Now, I can change slides myself. I don't know if that's just because I'm in the program, but it may be that you just want the next slide and people can change slides individually too. Or okay. I can change them. Molly, would you suggest I just keep changing them?
I think we each can change them. So I'm on the third slide that's simple of flying geese. Go or not. Okay.
Is there anyone that can say on the chat if they are able then to see us move the slides, or if you all need to move the slides yourself? Anybody can send that in. But let's go ahead.
Okay. I'm on the slide that says there are several embroidered initials on the flying geese in the upper. It doesn't say all of this. There are several initials in the upper right-hand corner of the quilt embroidered on the flying geese.
That was such an interesting little addition to this quilt, that there are these initials, which of course don't tell us much. If we have a name, we can often research them, but we can't with initials. But it does have these really subtle embroidered initials across. How many blocks? How many initials were on the quilt, Terry? I don't remember.
Robert Bishop, in his book called New Discoveries in American Quilts on page 18, which I can see in the view I'm looking at, said there were 20 sets. I'm not sure that there are 20 flying geese with initials on them. It may be that there are 20 initials, but there are several initials in any case.
Interesting. Okay, let's go to the next slide.
Okay. It's just an example of a flying goose. Shows some of the prints used in them. So the next slide, if I can manage to get to that one, is the maker's mark. In one of the chintzes, there's actually a maker's mark. Of course, now I don't think
is that a printer's mark, the person who, or the company?
I think it is, yes.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
Now, what that company is, I don't know. We might be able to research that. I didn't research it for this talk, but yeah, it's very clear AD. And I will say that I'm assuming, and for good reason that I'll explain later, that these are all English, very high end chintzes. So there aren't that many printers that would be impossible to figure that one out. Skipping the slide that is the picture of the quilt itself, because I was going to say, let's talk about the organization. And I did talk about the flying geese matching. You can see on the 8th slide, if you look between the orange and green arrows, they match perfectly. And if you look on the following, slide between the blue and the purple arrows, see red, white, tan, blue, tan, pink. It matches exactly all the way through the whole quilt.
Wow.
So what I did here on the slide number 10, if people are looking looking at it with where you can see the numbers of the slides. I obscured the chintzes with blocks of color. If the two colors match, it's exactly the same print or close to the same print. If the colors, the length of the colors tell you the length of the piece of chintz that's underneath that color. So you can sort of see that these are pretty much the same size. That idea of cutting the a piece of chintz in half and putting it on either side, using both sides, works here on this row of chintz. On the next row of chintz, well, you can see that on slide 11, because the maker of, and I'm going to call her she, because yes, there were men who did make quilts at this time period, but most of the people who make quilts at this time period were women. So you can see that the quilt has, from top to bottom of the two outside rows, a tan block, a green block, a medium brown block of chintz, a green block, and then another tan block. Okay, moving to the next slide. Moving to the next slide.
This
Suddenly,
is such an
see,
effective way, such an effective way of comparing, Terry. I love this.
Oh, good. It was the only way I could do it, because it's, if I started drawing lines across, you wouldn't get the idea when we got into these more brown areas of the quilt. Mm-hmm. But notice that the two yellows at the top aren't the same size. So my idea of cutting them and down the middle isn't certainly the way that she did every one of these. And at the bottom, you see one orange piece and one red piece. That means those are two different chintzes. She apparently ran out of one or both of those and had to substitute something else. If you go to the next slide, this would be slide 13, if people are following with the numbers. Again, you see a tiny red sliver at the top of the right-hand obscured row, followed by a yellow block of chintz, and on its corresponding strip of chintz to the left, there's a white box. So again, these are chintzes that don't match. I will say, however, if you look at the two pink slides close to the center, one's bright pink and one's sort of a dusty rose color. Mm-hmm. I was working from a picture because it's been way too many years since I've come and enjoyed this quilt. So I couldn't tell from the picture whether these were the same exact same or not. But though, as best I am able to tell, yes, they are.
I see.
Now, going to the next slide, we are at the middle. Notice that big turquoise piece in the center. That's a gorgeous piece of chintz. I have to wonder if the person who was making this quilt didn't decide it was just too pretty to cut up. That she was already scraps. She didn't perhaps want to cut it up. It is.
I could see that. Yeah.
I'll show you the beautiful chintz later on, but it's a honey. It really is. Now, the two purple pieces at the bottom, I do believe, are cut pieces from the exact same fabric, and I'll show you why. If you look at slide number 15, between the orange arrows is where the two pieces at the bottom of the center row were joined together. That's where the seam line is. If you use a image manipulation program and cut that in half and line them up side by side, you would get a picture like the center and right hand strip on this piece. And
there they are.
If you look, you can see the exact same motifs in the background fabric. Now, the florals on these two pieces are different, But I believe that if you actually had cut the piece in half, you would end up with some flowers on one side and different flowers on the other side. The alternative explanation for that, though, is if at this time, as a matter of fact, as early as around 1800, manufacturers were making sets of fabrics, what we would call lines of fabrics today, that go together and can be used together in a quilt. And we know they were doing this. This could be an example of that. Because this center strip, it's 11 inches wide, I'm really suspicious, though, that it was one piece of fabric.
It seems very, I think you make a good case for that.
Good. So, having talked about the organization of the quilt, I'd like to look for a little bit about the background on these fabrics. During the period of time when this quilt was made, fancy machine grounds were wildly popular. This particular piece is a cactus on a moire fancy machine ground. And I use the name moire in part because we have only a very few actual names to describe these backgrounds. If we go to look at some of the other backgrounds in the next slide, which would be number 18, if people are looking at it in the view more or less like it would be in PowerPoint, you can see a selection of different backgrounds. On this quilt, there are well over 20 different fancy machine grounds, and there are no names for most of them. Also,
hey everybody, Mom, sorry to interrupt. I fixed it. Thank you, Brian from Textport.
Thank you.
Do we need to stay where we're at, Molly, or go back into the studio?
You will be able to see it. It's on the screen right now. I have the PowerPoint up. So if you want to go back to the studio.
Oh, there we go. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry,
there's Molly.
Sorry.
Thanks, Molly. No, this has been working great. We're doing super.
Yeah.
But Terry, while we've got to stop in the action here, why do you call these machine grounds? Is there a particular reason you describe them that way?
There is. These grounds were engraved using an eccentric lathe. They used that to carve metals for other kinds of uses, like the backs of fancy watches and so forth and so on. And they became very popular during the period from 1830 to 1850, wildly popular. In fact, that's one dead giveaway for, if you see many of these kinds of grounds, you can pretty well date a quilt or piece by that alone. I will also point out that almost all of them, more than 99% of them, were brown or tan or something like that. I know of only 5 different prints that have green backgrounds. 2 of them show up in this Bars and Flying Geese quilt, or Wild Goose Chase quilt. We could call the ground second from the right on the top row picotage, all over picotage, but the rest of these would be basically impossible to describe. Actually, in my own mind, I described the one in the upper right-hand corner as fish eggs in a maze, and I'm pretty sure that's not going to sell with most designers. And the one below it is rickrack, but
oh, they're so beautiful, whatever they're called.
They are. This, however, is a wonderful opportunity for someone to do some great research. We don't have names for these things. We can't describe the fabrics adequately without names for these machine grounds. And someone would be doing a great service to go through and develop a set of names. I hate to put some people off, but there are hundreds of them. And if it is not quite possible to do names for all of them, if someone would at least name different groups of them, it would be so handy. I'm going to show you some pictures where you will see the same floral motifs or designs on a bunch of different backgrounds. And they are different fabrics, and they were printed at different times for different purposes. So really, we need names.
We do. That's the beauty of research. But that's what you've done with the florals. So we just have to have somebody do the grounds now.
There you go. Well, actually, going to the next slide, please. Next slide, Molly. Thank you. Oh, go to the next slide after that one. Thank you. I am going to use a term that my good friends Kay and Lori Triplett coined in their book, Chintz Quilts from the Pooh's Collection, and call these famous fabrics. And I have to say, I think the Dahlia fabric is one of the most famous. Wow. It is seen in so many chintz applique quilts. Don't you think so?
Oh, yes. Carol? It's such a beautiful print. And yes, you see it over and over again in all kinds of variations when it was cut apart, used. But this is great because this is probably the whole repeat in this photo.
Actually, there's another bouquet on this fabric, not on the quilt, not on this quilt we're discussing, but on another quilt. Let me do say one thing here. This particular fabric or floral motif, not with the same background, because you can see two different backgrounds in the lower right-hand corner, shows up 3 times on the quilt. And this is the only fabric that shows up 3 times on the quilt. Okay, next slide, please. But here you see there are a few more dahlias here on this one. They both are printed on the same fabric, we know. But this one is on a green background, and it's on the Virginia Quilt Museum's Jane Leshy quilt on a green background. And there is another companion print on the Jane Leshy quilt that's also on a green background. So of the only 5 different prints I know of on green backgrounds, 2 of them are on the Jane Leshy quilt and 2 are on this Wild Goose Chase. So
interesting. So this background, changing the background would just mean it was a kind of an inexpensive way to use the same floral print, but make it look like a very different fabric.
Right. It was a way of freshening up something. Maybe they had the fabric out for a few years, people had seen it, and a way to freshen it up would be to put it on a different background. Oh, look, it's on green. Personally, I think the green shows up floral prints a whole lot better than the brown.
I do love it.
I didn't live in that time period, and people back then liked the browns better for some reason.
Yeah, maybe more of a neutral. Who knows? It's such a gorgeous print, though, and I think that's why you and I just fell in love with these. Is because these early 19th century prints still had so much incredible, beautiful detail in them.
They did. They did.
Stunning.
Lyrically beautiful. Yep. Yes. Next slide, please. Okay. I'm supposed to be the person who can identify flowers. Unfortunately, I can't identify this thing. I call it in my own mind the brown flower. I was so anxious to try to identify it. A few years ago, I contacted Martin Ricks, who is the editor of Curtis's Botanical Magazine, which has been in print in Britain since 1794. It is now being being published by the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew. But Martin Ricks is the editor there, has written a number of books, articles on botanical illustrations, which we know were sources of designs for many different chintzes. And
Terry,
he and I together.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the name of the book again? You were cutting out just a little bit, so I couldn't catch it, and I don't know if our group did.
Oh.
The name of the book?
Is Curtis's Botanical Magazine. It was a magazine.
It's being reprinted.
No, it's being new. It's a magazine. There are new issues. It's been constantly.
Oh, I see.
You can actually download about the first 200 issues of it off the internet. If you go in and start searching for Curtis's Botanical Magazine, it's a kick. You go through and you read about the various flowers people were using in their gardens. The whole idea was people wanted new flowers for their gardens. It was almost a fixation. We want more. We want different. In any case, best we could come up with is this thing is possibly a member of the iris family. It's not an iris per se. We know that crocuses and Mexican shellflowers are members of the iris family too. So this is probably just a different genus that I haven't, and he hasn't managed to come across. But
could it possibly just be a stylized version an artist created too, so that maybe just reminiscent of other plants?
It very well could be. It also could be that we're dead wrong and this is something totally different. But
typically typically you can identify the plants though. So it's unusual that you can't find this one?
Often I can, not always. I think my frustration is because it is so popular, it's so lovely, and I can't identify it more than anything.
It is beautiful.
I've talked to people have asked me, are you sure it's brown? And it's not purple that has decayed to brown over time. And all I can say is I've looked at a whole lot of pieces that include this print, and they're all brown. There aren't any of them that show any purple to them. So I honestly believe it was printed originally brown. But this is one of the two. Yeah, it's gorgeous. It's one of the two pieces on the quilt on a green background. So next slide, please. Thank you. It actually comes in two different colorways. The picture on the right is a full chintz, like the one on the Bars and Flying Geese quilt. Sorry, that's my affectionate term for the quilt. A full chintz means it has several reds and several different colors on the flower, and in this case, the big difference besides a couple of the reds is that it has yellow in it. Picture to the left is what's called a half chintz, and that means it has fewer different colors in it, fewer reds and no yellow, or no yellow except possibly in the leaves so that they're green. At the bottom, I saw on a whole cloth quilt on Etsy, and I think it was a faded version of it. I'm not certain. It might be maybe a different colorway, but I think it's just a faded version. Okay. Wow. Next slide, please.
Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure how, pardon?
It's so interesting to see all these variations and the different colorways that were used. But it makes sense. You used your print that you made. You used your roller print or whatever you had. You used it in many different ways to make the most of it once you had that created.
Right. But I'm also showing them for two reasons. One of them is to convince people to start giving us names for these backgrounds. And one of them is the things that chintzes that you see on the quilt we're talking about are all highest and full chintz, highest quality fabrics. And I think that says something important. It gives us some hints about who made the quilt and where it was made, I think. This background on this on these two pieces, I think the piece from Winterthur on the left is the usual colorway for the one on the upper right. But in both cases, there is what's called a vermiculate machine ground. Vermiculate comes from the Latin word vermis for worm, like. So it's kind of twisted around. See, that's my fish eggs in a maze wasn't all that far off.
No, it wasn't.
In any case, those of us who are machine quilters would recognize it more as the kind of pattern we use for stippling.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, next slide, please. On this particular example, which is a full chintz, and this is a quilt block that has been in a closet or in a box or something for many, many years, so it hasn't lost color. But you'll notice the green arrow pointing to an area where the person who did the applique did not cut away the background. So we know the background is dark
Solid. Yeah.
tan. Solid. Yep. Next slide, please. So this is the Catherine Waring quilt from the Daughters of the American Revolution. And the blue arrows point to the edges of the applique. Notice it's a white background. Caroline,
Right.
do you want to talk about your idea from the
So
American
my random hypothesis. We actually did look when we were working on. I have our volume, American Quilts in an Industrial Age. We did a lot of analysis of the collection, and it's a great volume about the period of 1760 to 1870. If you're interested in that, we sell both this and American Quilts in the modern age. So these were big retrospectives of our collection. And I started seeing that white ground when we were doing these really in-depth research projects on each type of quilt. And I really did wonder, and we found a number of them. I think we found over 20 in our collection that had a very simple ground on it. And I wondered at that time, and I have no proof of any of this, but I wondered if it was something that manufacturers eventually did to make the fabric maybe a little more affordable, but also to make your cutout chintz applique a little bit easier, because you didn't have to cut out all the details, and it just kind of blends in with the white background of your quilt. But did they simplify the fabrics because it was more economically sound? That I have found that usually these changes happen because of very practical reasons. So it might have just been that it was cheaper.
I don't think so. I think your hypothesis was right. There were a lot of people doing some really gorgeous chintz applique quilts, and this would make their lives easier. There's a lot of sewing on one of those things, and anything that would make it easier for me would be high on my list to acquire. So
yeah. Well, it's interesting that you see all the whole variation of it, from those beautiful, beautiful machine grounds to just either a solid color or just a white.
It really makes a difference in how, in the fabric form, in how the floral arrangements show up. It makes a huge difference. And I
really
think that that's a big reason for it as well.
Well, Terry, we're only have about 10 minutes left, so just to know that as we're going through. Maybe we can go a few minutes over since we had kind of a rough start, but let's go to the next then.
Okay. This is a beautiful. This is a beautiful bird's nest. Bird's nest and flowers chintz, for want of another name, that is in that turquoise. Hang on just a second. In that turquoise strip in the center row of chintz, and it is normally seen not in the fabric, in pieces of fabric in quilts so often as in chintz appliques. Next slide, please.
Yeah,
Here
that's
is
how I
another from the IQM with a couple of those appliques. And next slide, please. The tulip from that particular print is often found separated from the rest of the print in composites, composite arrangements in chintz appliques. And we don't have time to talk about all of them, but if you go to the tulip page and navigate to page 4 on the Flowers on Chintz.com website, you can see a list of places where you can find this tulip. Next slide, please.
Oh, I love this print so much.
This small cactus print isn't probably one of the most famous ones, but we both love it a lot.
We do.
And it's an interesting print on this particular quilt because there are only 2 pieces in the quilt and they each have different machine backgrounds behind them. Notice how different they look just based on the background.
It's amazing
Next slide.
how different they look.
Yeah. Well, this may be a little hard to see, but here it is again as the setting triangles on this particular, this is the center of a quilt from the IQM's collection.
Yeah, this is from the Goose collection. Yeah.
Right.
From Lori and Goose collection.
You can see it in the book, their book, Chintz Quilts from the Goose collection. Next slide, please. This is the entwined stem discocactus from the Bars and Flying Geese quilt. I put it on its side so you could see more of it. There is a sprays of fern-like, they're fern-like sprays entangled with the stems of the cactus, but you can't see them because they are on a very busy, fancy ground. Next slide, please.
There they are.
This shows you can see the fern-like things, but you can also see that the background is really busy. And whoever does take on the job of naming these things is going to have a really fun time trying to name this particular background.
It's actually little stars. I never saw that.
It's bubbles and stars. Yeah.
There we go. We got a name for it.
Vertical lines and diagonal lines in there. It's really crazy. Next slide, please. Here it is on a green background, another one of the green backgrounds from the Hermitage, which is Andrew Jackson's home in Nashville, Tennessee. And you can see, notice different color background means you can see those nice little fern-like sprays a lot more easily. Next slide, please. The discocactus with roots. I'm just going to zip on to the next slide. Here it is in a different colorway on a different background. Next slide, please. Here it is in a single quilt block from the Charleston Museum. Notice the little inset with the roots, white background. Boy, you wouldn't applique those roots unless you did it this way, would you? Nope.
No, you couldn't. You really couldn't.
Right. I believe that applique people wanted to keep all the detail. These are beautiful prints and they wanted the detail. Next slide, please. Another one from private collection with penciled blue. Next slide, please. Half chintz on a different background. Next slide, please. We didn't have time to go through all the floral prints. We sure didn't have time to go through all the backgrounds. Here are a few of the small, pretty ones from the quilt. There are many more. People, you need to go see this quilt. It is a knockout.
It is a knockout.
Next slide, please. So we can make a few observations about the quilt. First, that it was highly organized. Next slide. The fabrics all had fancy backgrounds. Next slide. The prints were over a 20-year period or less, printed over a 20-year period or less. I think it was a few years, though, because we saw different back with the same floral motifs. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I've just made that point. Next slide, please. There are different sizes of floral motifs in the chintzes, which makes this quilt interesting. Next slide, please. You don't want everything the same size. Come on. You got to give some variety. Also, I think this is a really valuable quilt because it gives us an insight into what the motifs look like on the fabric in which they were printed. Next slide, please. The quilter had an organized mind. Next slide. She had a lot of experience and great design skills to be able to take a stack of scraps and put them together into something so beautiful. Next slide, please. She probably owned, worked for, or had access to scraps from a fabric merchant or an upholstery shop. I don't think, unless she was very, very well off, she would have had all these different scraps laying around the house. She would have had to make a whole lot of either home deck projects or quilts in order to have this many scraps.
Yeah.
Next slide. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off.
It makes sense that she had some kind of access to being able to get a lot of those bits and bobs of it.
Yeah. And she most likely lived and or worked in a large metropolitan area.
Yeah, again.
So, next one.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You know, your next question is an interesting one, Terry. Are we certain this piece is American? You know, we are not. But we both feel really strongly that we're looking at mostly English fabrics because we know that's where the States was getting most of their fabric was from England. Probably some French fabrics coming in as well, but England had they kept a stranglehold on that market for chintz. So even if it is an American quilt, we're still looking at mostly or all English fabrics, don't you think?
I absolutely think so for two reasons. One, I don't think they were printing many fancy machine grounds in other countries. France went a whole different direction in the way they designed fabrics. And interestingly, second, we know that for many years, one engraver, Joseph Lockett, engraved all of the fancy grounds.
Really?
In Britain, yes. I'm quoting Philip Sykes's doctoral dissertation. All of them for about 40 years. So we can pretty much say that all these prints in this quilt, or a good many of them, must have been engraved by him. Now, he made engravings for everybody. And in 1842, when it became legal for other countries for him to ship to other countries, he started doing that. But most of his trade was with the United States and in, Great Britain. So,
well, that's fascinating to know that there was one person that was working on all those. He must have just been so good at it that he just was amazing.
He had a collection of over 20,000 designs. That is not to scare off someone who is 20,000. Yep. So
that's amazing.
So I hope we have convinced you that this is a quilt you have to see. And I also hope that if you have a session, you will keep my phone number.
I'm sorry, Terry, you cut out there. I didn't catch that last bit.
I said if IQM ever decides to deaccession this, you will keep my phone number.
I can pretty much guarantee it's not going anywhere, Terry, but you never know. It is just so spectacular. And don't you agree? It's being able to see the chintzes in yardage form like that just gives you a whole different feel for them and picture of them. And that's why this quilt's so important.
It's true. And if you see two different flowers from the same print, and you then see them on two different quilts in chintz appliques, for example, you have a date for one, not the other, because you have a material document saying that they were printed at the same time because they're on the same print. You can date the second one very confidently. That's only one example of the way you can use knowledge from fabric on which the flowers are printed.
Well, Terry, that's just been amazing because you have done just incredible research and added so much to our knowledge of chintz quilts particularly, or chintz fabrics particularly. And I really encourage people to go to your website where you put all of these images together. I mean, it's a beautiful site to go to just to enjoy it. But I think it just shows how really diligent study and a very methodical, and obviously you have an organized mind because you're able to organize all those bits and pieces from these fabrics and put them together in a way that then you can communicate to us. And that makes a lot of sense. So yeah, there's more research that's really needs to be done.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. I've enjoyed it tremendously. We've got to talk more.
Yes, we do. It's such beautiful fabric, and there's just so much more we can learn. There's so much more we can learn. So definitely get in touch with Terry. You can find her through American Quilt Study Group, or reach out to her or I through email, and get involved. And let's keep this, that's one of the things that is so exciting about research, is watching other people build on what we know and just make it so much richer always. So we are over time a few minutes, but Molly, thank you so much for getting everything situated for us. We had a slow start, but it was worth the wait. And we appreciate all you being here today. We have renewed Quiltside chats for next year. So the next time we'll be together won't be till March, but we will do a quarterly Quiltside chat. So look for more information about that soon. So thank you, Terry. Thank you so much for being here, everybody. Really appreciate it. Everybody have a wonderful holiday, and we will see you in 2024.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.